want to talk a little bit about change today, organizational change. I'm Lois Sonstegard, and one of the things that teams and organizations often struggle with is how do you introduce change and do it effectively? There's a wonderful book by John Kotter. Kotter has done incredible work on the subject of change. He's a Harvard professor, and he says there's 8 steps to change. I want to go through these very quickly and then get into his book. It's a fable, and I'm going to read it to you, abridged, but I am going to share it with you because it is just delightful. Here are the 8 steps. 1. Create a sense of urgency. What's needed for change? Pull a team together. 3. Develop the change vision and strategy that's necessary. Make it happen by communicating for understanding and get buy-in. Buy-in is so hard, isn't it, sometimes? Empower others to act. 6. Produce short-term wins. Don't let up. Number 7. And finally, 8. Create a new culture and in that what you want to do is to make it strong enough to replace old traditions. So a lot of times we get stuck on those old traditions, don't we? And we just don't move forward. Now, into the fable of John Kotter. Our iceberg is melting. If you've never read it, get a copy of it. It is absolutely delightful, and it will open your eyes to things that you can think about relative to change. It is a story about penguins in Antarctica, and they live in a place called Cape Washington. Iceberg had been their home for many, many years. It was surrounded by a sea rich in food. There were huge walls of eternal snow that gave the penguins shelter from dreadful winter storms. As far back as the penguins could remember, this had been their home, and they lived as if they were a family. 268 penguins lived there, and one of them was named Fred. Fred looked and acted much like the others. He was cute, but he was also unusually curious and observant. Fred fished less, studied icebergs more, and the sea. He socialized less than the average. He frequently went off by himself to take notes on what he observed. He was just doing what seemed right to him. As a result, he was becoming increasingly alarmed by what he saw. The iceberg is melting and might break apart soon. An iceberg that suddenly collapsed into many pieces would be a disaster for the penguins, especially if it occurred during the winter in a storm. Many of the older and younger birds would surely die. Who could say what all the consequences would be? Like all unthinkable events, there was no plan for how to deal with such a catastrophe. Fred knew he needed to do something, but he didn't want to end up being like Harold, who was another penguin who, like him, had gotten curious and worried about what was happening, and when he told others, he was made fun of, belittled, and ostracized. So what to do now? Fred decided to go to the Leadership Council and to Alice. Alice was one of the bosses of the 10 bosses in the Leadership Council. She was tough, practical, and had a reputation for getting things done. She was also close to the colony, unlike many of her peers. Actually, all of their breed of penguins look a bit aloof, but Alice had a closeness. Fred decided that Alice could help. When he told Alice sort of at first ignored Fred, and then she said, "Take me to that place." And so they dove under the surface, and Fred pointed out the fissures and the other clear symptoms of deterioration caused by melting. Alice was amazed at how she had managed to ignore these signs. Alice continued to follow Fred as he turned into a large hole by a side wall of the iceberg. Through a canal a few meters wide, they swam deep into the heart of the ice, eventually reaching a spacious cave filled with water. Alice tried to look at it as if she totally understood what she was seeing, but leadership was her specialty, not the science of icebergs. Fred saw her perplexed look, so he said, "Icebergs are not like ice cubes. The bergs can have cracks inside called canals. The canals can lead to large air bubbles called caves. If the ice melts sufficiently, cracks can be exposed to water, which would then pour into the canals and caves. During a cold winter, the narrow canals filled with water can freeze quickly, tapping water inside the caves. But as the temperature goes lower and lower, the water in the caves also freeze. Because a freezing liquid dramatically expands in volume, an iceberg can be broken in pieces. Wow, the magnitude of this problem. This was definitely not good. Alice was shaken. What do we do with this problem? They decided to take it to the Leadership Council. Lois was the head of the Leadership Council. He didn't want to schedule a meeting at first until all of the information was gathered. And so, with Alice's help, the council was convened, and Fred prepared by constructing a model of an iceberg. It was 4 feet by 5 and made of real ice and snow. The construction was not easy for Fred, but it was done. The night before the meeting, Fred and his friends moved the model to where the leadership team met, and there they could take a look at what it was that was happening. Alice introduced Fred, Lois started the meeting, and Fred started explaining what it was that he had seen. The head meteorologist for the group, his name was Nono. He listened to what was being said, and he said, "This junior bird says melting ice has opened that canal, but maybe it hasn't. He says the canal will freeze this winter and trap the water in a big cave, but maybe it won't. He says the water in the cave will freeze, but maybe it will not. He says freezing water always expands in volume, but maybe he's wrong. And even if what he says is all true, is our iceberg really so fragile that freezing water in a cave can break it into dangerously small pieces? How do we know what he says is not just a theory? What speculation and wild fear-mongering is this?" Nono paused, glared at the others, and threw what he hoped was a knockout punch. Can he guarantee that his data and conclusions are 100% accurate? The birds looked at one another, uncertain. And then Alice said, "Fred, can you explain this further?" Fred went down and got a bottle and brought it back, and Alice said, "What is this?" Fred said, "I don't know. My father found it one summer washed up on the edge of an iceberg. It looks like ice, but it's not made from ice." He pecked on the bottle with the tip of his beak. "It's much harder than ice, and if you sit on it, it warms up, but it doesn't melt." Everyone stared. "So, perhaps we could fill it with water, seal the hole on top, and place it in the cold wind. Then tomorrow we can see if it is broken by the force of the expanding water as it freezes." Fred paused as the rest of the group worked their way through the logic of his statements. And so the next day, Buddy went to get the bottle. He was handsome and one of the youngest, trusted and liked by all. When Buddy came back with the bottle, he produced it and he showed that it was clearly broken from ice that had grown too big to fit inside. "I'm convinced," Buddy told them. The birds began to jabber back and forth for about half an hour. Lois said, "Let the others know and we will have an assembly, but don't tell them the topic yet." So when the assembly came together, Alice told of her swim with Fred and the many signs of melting and the open cave filled with water. Fred showed his model of the iceberg and explained why he thought they were in danger. Buddy told the story of the glass bottle, and Lois, as head penguin, ended the session by saying, in his opinion, they had to act. And though he was not sure how, he was confident they had to find a solution. By the time everyone had a chance to see the model and the bottle up close, to ask both Fred and Alice questions, and to hear more from Lois, the meeting had lasted most of the morning. The birds were stunned, even those who normally responded to anything by saying, "Well, yes, but," the complacent seeing that all is just fine, 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 thank you, began to drain into a vast ocean. Lois and Alice were certainly not aware of it. Professional change experts, they were not. But by reducing complacency and increasing urgency, they had taken exactly the right first step in potentially saving the colony. And so they decided to gather a team together, a scout team, to take a look at what needed to be done. And the scout team consisted of Louis, the head penguin, and he had enough experience to be wise, patient, a bit conservative, but not easily flustered. Alice, of course, who was practical, aggressive, and made things happen, didn't care about status and treated everybody the same. Buddy, boyishly handsome, and not in the least bit ambitious, was trusted and liked by everyone. Of course, Fred, amazingly curious and creative. Jordan, the professor, well-read and fascinated by interesting questions. And then the head penguin. And so the group gathered. And as they went out and investigated, they noticed the seagull above, flying. And as they watched, they saw the seagull land and begin to check different places. And they went to the seagull and they said, "What is it that you're doing?" He said, "I'm a scout and I go out ahead of my clan to look for places where we can go, where it is safe and there is food." And as the penguins listened to the story, they said, "Perhaps we can do the same. We can go out and look and see what there is that would be good for our people." And so it was decided that they would send out scouts. But there was a problem with that. The problem was the scouts would need food when they returned home, and they would be tired and exhausted and would not have time to fish for their own food. Problem was penguins only fished for their own food. They fed their own families, but they didn't feed others. And so as they were debating what to do, a young penguin said, "Well, we could have a fair, and we could have each person bring 2 fishes as a prize." And so with the scouts then, if they're successful, can have those fish that we bring as prizes. And so the second wave went out looking for a place where they could live and they could be. And they found a place where the elderly penguins could go and the children could get to safely. And they were able to live and find a new way of being safe and continuing. The most remarkable thing is that traditions die a very hard death. Culture changes with as much difficulty in penguin colonies as it does in human colonies. And so they had to work at it. They told the stories. One of the jobs became Lewis's job as he retired from the council. He became the chief #1 teacher. He was asked again and again by the younger birds to tell the story of the great change. At first he was reluctant, fearing that he would sound like the old-timer boasting about past success, real or imagined. But eventually he saw the importance of telling the chicks in as interesting a fun way as he could about the specific steps the colony had taken. He talked about Fred's finding that the iceberg was melting, and then how they created a sense of urgency in the colony to deal with the difficult problem, put a carefully selected group in charge of guiding the change, found the sensible vision of a better future, communicated that vision so others would understand and accept it, removed as many obstacles to action as was practical, created some sort of success quickly, never let up until the new way of life was firmly established, and finally ensured that changes would not be overcome by stubborn, hard-to-die traditions. Although Lewis never said so explicitly in his telling of the story, he felt the most remarkable change of all was in how so many members of the colony had grown less afraid of change. Yes, they were learning the specific steps needed to make any large adjustment to new circumstances, and worked well together to keep leaping into better and better future. And that is our challenge today, isn't it? In the midst of many changes, We have the choice of how we move ahead. We can move ahead in a positive, effective way. Read this book. You will find it challenging and fascinating. Thanks so much for listening.